The wind on the Nebraska plains could carry a man's voice for miles, but this one barely made it across the fence. "Sir, could you pretend to be my daddy just for one day?" Tom Avery froze mid-step. He'd been walking the fence line of his small homestead, checking for breaks after last night's storm, when he saw him, a boy no older than 8, thin as a fence post, his shirt hanging loose on his shoulders. His hair was the color of wheat left too long in the sun, and his eyes were the kind that had seen more than they should have. Tom's first instinct was to ask where the boy's parents were, but something in the way the child gripped the top rail, white-knuckled, like it was the only thing keeping him upright, stopped him. "What's your name, son?" Tom asked. The boy hesitated. "Daniel." "Where's your ma or pa, Daniel?" The boy's gaze dropped to the dust at his feet. "Ain't got a ma. Pa, he left me down the road. Said he'd be back after the cattle sale of pa's. That was 3 days ago." Tom felt the words settle heavy in his chest. Out here, 3 days alone could be a lifetime. Coyotes, storms, worse things that walked on 2 legs. "And why'd you ask me to pretend to be your daddy?" Tom said, keeping his voice gentle. Daniel's eyes lifted, and for the first time Tom saw the truth in them, not just hunger, but a kind of quiet desperation. "There's a church picnic in town today. They don't let orphans in without family. I just wanted to eat with the other kids." Just for one day, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter from somewhere far off. Maybe the town, maybe just the echo of what Daniel was missing. Tom looked at the boy, at the fence between them, and felt something stir that he thought had died with his own wife and child years ago. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just reached out a calloused hand over the rail. Daniel took it. Tom didn't remember deciding. One moment he was standing at the fence with the boy's small hand in his. The next he was saddling his old bay mare, the leather creaking in the cool morning air. Daniel stood nearby, watching with a mix of hope and caution, like a stray dog unsure if the offered food was a trick. "You ever ride double?" Tom asked. Daniel shook his head. "Well, you will today." Tom swung into the saddle, then reached down. Daniel hesitated only a second before letting Tom lift him up. The boy was light, too light, and Tom felt the sharp edges of bone through the thin shirt. They set off toward town, the prairie stretching wide and endless around them. The wind carried the scent of wild sage, and somewhere far off a meadowlark sang. Daniel sat stiff at first, hands gripping the saddle horn, but after a mile he leaned back just enough for Tom to feel the weight of him settle. "You from around here?" Tom asked. "Not really. Pa kept us moving. Said staying in one place makes you soft." Tom grunted. "Staying in one place can make you strong, too." Daniel didn't answer, but Tom caught the way his head tilted, like he was filing that away. As they crested the low ridge, the town came into view. A scatter of buildings along the main street, the white steeple of the church rising above them. Even from here, Tom could hear faint music and laughter. The picnic was already underway. Daniel's grip on the saddle horn tightened. "You sure they'll believe you're my pa?" Tom glanced down at him. "I reckon they'll believe whatever we tell 'em, and if they don't, they'll keep it to themselves." They rode into town slow, the way you do when you want to be noticed but not challenged. Folks turned to look. The quiet farmer who kept to himself, now with a boy riding behind him. Some nodded politely. Others whispered. At the churchyard gate, Tom swung down and helped Daniel to the ground. The boy's eyes darted over the tables piled with food, the other children chasing each other in the grass. "Remember," Tom said, crouching so they were eye to eye, "today I'm your pa. You stick close, you eat your fill, and you don't let anyone tell you don't belong here." Daniel nodded, and for the first time, Tom saw a flicker of something in his face. Not just hope, but trust. They stepped through the gate together, the smell of fresh bread and smoked ham wrapped around Daniel like a blanket. For a moment, he forgot to be cautious. His eyes darted from the pies cooling on the table to the children chasing each other through the grass. Tom kept a steady hand on the boy's shoulder as they moved among the crowd. He nodded to Mrs. Carter, who was ladling lemonade into tin cups, and tipped his hat to the preacher. "Didn't know you had kin, Tom," Mrs. Carter said, her eyes narrowing just a touch. "Didn't know I needed to tell you everything," Tom replied, his voice easy but edged. Daniel stood a little taller beside him, as if the words were a shield. They found a spot under the shade of a cottonwood. Tom handed Daniel a plate piled high, cornbread, beans, a thick slice of ham. The boy ate like someone afraid the food might vanish if he looked away. Across the yard, a man in a brown duster leaned against the fence watching. He wasn't part of the congregation. Tom knew everyone here, and this one was a stranger. The man's gaze lingered on Daniel, and Tom felt the hairs on his neck rise. "Tom," the preacher called, waving him over, "need a word about the harvest drive?" Tom hesitated, then crouched to Daniel's level. "Stay here. Don't wander. And if anyone asks, I'm your pa. Say it like you mean it." Daniel nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the man in the duster. By the time Tom turned back from the preacher, the stranger was gone. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwoods, dappling the churchyard in gold. Laughter and fiddle music drifted over the tables, but Tom's mind wasn't on the food or the music. He kept scanning the crowd, looking for the man in the brown duster. Daniel sat cross-legged on the grass, working his way through a second slice of pie. Every so often he'd glance toward the gate, as if expecting someone to come through it. "You're quiet," Tom said, lowering himself onto the bench beside him. Daniel shrugged. "Just thinking." "About what?" The boy hesitated. "About how long a day is." Tom studied him. "Feels longer when you're waiting for it to end, huh?" Daniel didn't answer, but his fork slowed. Across the yard, Mrs. Carter was whispering to two other women, their eyes flicking toward Tom and the boy. He could almost hear the words, "Where'd he come from? Whose child is that?" Tom's jaw tightened. He'd lived in this town long enough to know that curiosity could turn to suspicion in a heartbeat, and suspicion had a way of drawing trouble. The trouble arrived sooner than he liked. A shadow fell across the table. Tom looked up to see the stranger in the brown duster standing there, hat low, dust on his boots. Up close, the man's face was lean, weather-worn, and his eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky. "Afternoon," the man said, voice low. "Mind if I have a word with the boy?" Tom rose slowly, placing himself between Daniel and the stranger. "Depends on who's asking." The man's gaze didn't waver. "Name's Carter Briggs. I've been looking for him." Daniel's fork clattered against the plate. His face went pale, and he gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles whitened. Tom's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "You've found him. Now tell me why." Briggs's eyes flicked to Daniel, then back to Tom. "That's between me and the boy." "Best you step aside." Tom didn't move. Around them, the picnic chatter had quieted. People were watching now, the way they watch a storm roll in. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Tom, please don't let him take me." Tom's hand settled on the boy's shoulder, firm and steady. "You heard him," he said to Briggs. "He's with me." The man's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." He turned and walked away, but Tom knew this wasn't over. The way Briggs moved, slow, deliberate, told him the man wasn't leaving town. As the music started up again, Tom sat back down, his mind already working. He didn't know who Carter Briggs was or what claim he thought he had on Daniel, but one thing was certain. Pretending to be the boy's father had just turned into something far more dangerous. The sun was gone by the time Tom and Daniel left the churchyard. The prairie sky had turned a deep indigo, the first stars pricking through like cold pinholes of light. The air smelled of dust and cooling earth, and the only sound was the steady clop of the mare's hooves on the hard-packed road. Daniel rode in front this time, small hands gripping the saddle horn. He hadn't said a word since the stranger appeared. "You gonna tell me who he is?" Tom asked at last, his voice low. Daniel's shoulders hunched. "Don't matter. He'll find me anyway." "That's not an answer." The boy was silent for a long moment. "He worked for my pa. Sometimes he took me places. Pa didn't always know. Sometimes he did." Tom felt a cold knot form in his gut. "And now?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "Now he says I belong to him." They rode the rest of the way in silence. Back at the homestead, Tom lit the lamp and set it on the table. The warm glow filled the small room, chasing back the shadows, but it didn't ease the tightness in his chest. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "You're safe here tonight," Tom said. "But if Briggs is still in town come morning, we'll have to decide what to do." Daniel looked up, eyes wide. "You mean run?" "Maybe. Or maybe stand our ground. Depends on what he's after and how far he's willing to go." The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yipped, the sound sharp and lonely. Tom poured 2 mugs of coffee, one for himself, one with more milk than coffee for Daniel, and sat across from him. "If I'm going to protect you, I need the truth." All of it. Daniel's fingers tightened around the mug. "Truth is, my pa owed him money. Lost it gambling. Briggs said he'd take me until the debt was paid. Pa let him. But then Pa stopped coming back." Tom's jaw clenched. "And how'd you get away?" Daniel's gaze dropped. "I didn't. He left me with some folks out near the border. Said he'd be back. He never was. I ran before they could send me somewhere worse." Tom leaned back, the chair creaking. The boy's story was jagged, but the fear in his voice was smooth and certain, the kind that came from living it. Later, after Daniel had fallen asleep under a quilt too big for him, Tom stepped out onto the porch. The moon was high, silver in the grasslands. In the distance, a single lantern bobbed along the road, too far to make out the rider, but close enough to set Tom's teeth on edge. He rested a hand on the rifle propped by the door. Pretending to be Daniel's father had been a kindness this morning. Tonight, it felt like a promise, and promises, Tom knew, were worth fighting for. The wind had shifted by midnight, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the low rustle of dry grass. Tom sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, the lamplight from inside spilling a warm rectangle onto the boards. Beyond that glow, the prairie was a black ocean, the horizon swallowed by night. Daniel was asleep inside, curled under the quilt, his breathing soft and steady. Tom had checked on him twice in the last hour, each time feeling the same knot in his chest, the one that had been tightening since Carter Briggs first laid eyes on the boy. Somewhere out there, a coyote yipped, answered by another farther off. The sound was thin, lonely, but it wasn't what kept Tom's hand near the rifle stock. It was the lantern. He'd seen it earlier, a faint, bobbing light on the road, too far to make out the rider. Now it was closer, moving slow, deliberate, like a man who wanted to be seen but not rushed. Tom rose, stepped down into the yard, and waited. The mare in the corral shifted uneasily, ears flicking toward the road. The lantern stopped about 50 yards out. The light swayed, then stilled. "Evening, Tom," came the voice, low, carrying just enough to reach him. "Briggs," Tom said, his own voice flat. The man stepped into the edge of the lamplight. The brown duster looked darker now, damp with dew. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but Tom could feel the weight of his stare. "Didn't mean to spook you," Briggs said. "Just figured we ought to talk without all those church folk listening in." Tom didn't move. "You had your chance earlier." Briggs smiled, a thin, humorless thing. "Boy's not yours. Never was. You know it. I know it. Question is, what are you going to do when the man who owns him comes to collect?" Tom's grip on the rifle tightened. "Ain't no man owns a child." Briggs tilted his head. "Debt's a kind of ownership. His pa owed me more than he could pay. Left the boy as collateral. That makes him mine until the debt's cleared. That's not how it works here." Briggs took a slow step forward. "Maybe not in your tidy little town, but out there," he jerked his chin toward the dark prairie, "things get settled different." From inside the cabin came the faint creak of the floorboards. Tom didn't have to look to know Daniel was awake, listening. "You're not taking him," Tom said. Briggs's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You willing to die over a boy you met yesterday?" Tom didn't answer right away. He thought of the way Daniel had leaned back against him on the ride into town, the way his eyes had lit up at the sight of the picnic tables, the way his voice had cracked when he'd said, "Please don't let him take me." "Yeah," Tom said finally, "I reckon I am." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The lantern between them swayed in the breeze, casting long, shifting shadows across the yard. Briggs's hand hovered near his coat, not quite touching whatever was inside, but close enough to make the message clear. "You think you can keep watch forever? I've got time, Tom, more than you, and the boy's got to sleep sometime." Tom took a step forward, closing the distance by half. "Then you'd best hope you're gone before morning." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Briggs chuckled, a low, ugly sound, and stepped back into the dark. The lantern bobbed away, swallowed by the night. Tom stood there until the light was gone, the only sound the wind in the grass and the pounding of his own heart. Inside, Daniel was sitting up in bed, eyes wide. Was that him? Tom set the rifle by the door and knelt beside the bed. "Yeah, but he's gone for now." Daniel swallowed hard. "He'll come back." Tom nodded. "Maybe. But next time, we'll be ready." The boy hesitated, then reached out, not for the quilt, but for Tom's hand. Tom took it, feeling the small, fierce grip, In that moment, the pretense was gone. Whatever this had started as, it wasn't pretend anymore. The first pale streaks of dawn were just brushing the eastern sky when Tom stepped out onto the porch. The air was sharp with cold, the kind that made breath plume in front of you, and the prairie lay still under a thin veil of mist. He'd been awake all night, sitting in the rocker with the rifle across his knees, listening for hoofbeats. He didn't have to wait long. The sound came faint at first, a low, rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat, in the distance. Then it grew, joined by the jingle of tack and the occasional snort of a horse. Tom's eyes narrowed as shapes began to form in the mist. 3 riders, side by side, moving slow but steady toward the homestead. Carter Briggs was in the middle, his brown duster flaring slightly with each step of his black gelding. On either side rode 2 men Tom didn't recognize, both broad-shouldered, both armed, the kind of men you hired when you wanted to make a point. Inside the cabin, Daniel stirred. Tom heard the creak of the bed, then the soft pad of bare feet on the floorboards. The boy appeared in the doorway, hair mussed, eyes wide. "They're here," Daniel whispered. "I see 'em," Tom said, never taking his eyes off the riders. "Stay inside." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want you out there alone." Tom glanced back, and for a moment their eyes locked, the boy's full of fear, Tom steady but not unfeeling. "You're not alone if I'm out there. You're safe. That's the point." Daniel swallowed hard, then stepped back into the shadows of the cabin. The riders pulled up at the edge of the yard. Briggs tipped his hat, the gesture slow and mocking. "Morning, Tom," he called. "Fine day for settling debts." Tom rested the rifle against his shoulder. "You rode a long way for nothing." Briggs's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I rode a long way for what's mine." "You've had your fun playing house with a boy. Time to hand him over. He's not yours," Tom said flatly. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle. "You think that matters?" "Out here, possession's 9/10 of the law. His pa gave him to me fair and square." "That's not law," Tom said. "That's slavery." One of Briggs's men shifted in the saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. The other spat into the dirt, eyes locked on Tom. "You gonna make this hard, Avery?" Briggs asked. Tom's voice was calm, but it carried. "I'm gonna make it impossible." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of leather and the distant cry of a meadowlark. The sun was climbing now, burning away the mist, throwing long shadows across the yard. Briggs's smile faded. "Last chance. Step aside, and I'll let you keep breathing." Tom didn't move. "You take one step closer, and you'll find out how fast I can pull this trigger." From inside the cabin came the faint scrape of wood. Daniel, peeking through the shutters. Briggs's gaze flicked toward the movement, and something cold lit in his eyes. "You think you can keep him forever?" Briggs said. "Boys like that, they don't stay. They get taken." One way or another, Tom's jaw tightened. "Not today." The next moments happened fast. One of Briggs's men nudged his horse forward, hand going for his gun. Tom's rifle came up smooth, the barrel steady. "Don't," Tom said. The man froze, eyes narrowing. Briggs chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You've got grit, Avery. I'll give you that. But grit runs out. Food runs out. Sleep runs out. And when it does, I'll be here." He pulled his reins, turning the gelding. The 2 hired guns followed, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. Briggs looked back over his shoulder. "Enjoy your day, Tom." could be your last quiet one, they rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the prairie until there was only the wind again. Tom lowered the rifle but didn't relax. He stood there until the horizon swallowed him, then turned toward the cabin. Daniel was at the door, his small hands gripping the frame. "They'll come back," the boy said. Tom nodded. "Yeah, but so will I." For the first time since they'd met, Daniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Tom's waist. Tom rested a hand on the boy's head, the gesture awkward but certain. Whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it together. Dawn brought not only light, but decisions. When Carter Briggs returned with horses and brazen certainty, Tom stood on the porch not merely with a rifle in his hands, but with a steady resolve in his voice and people at his back. Neighbors he barely knew by sight, yet who in that moment needed few words to know on which side the truth lay. The confrontation did not become a shootout, because Tom sought not death, but a home and safety for the boy. And when Briggs, for the first time, saw that a debt did not give him rights over a child's life, his predator's mask cracked and his attempts at intimidation lost force before the communal disapproval and the firmness of those who might otherwise have stayed out of it. A judge from the nearest town took up the case because the word humanity suddenly rang louder than legal loopholes, and the truth, slow but sure, unraveled Briggs's story. Papers and witnesses revealed that trafficking and trading children was a crime even in those parts, and that a debt dealer had no claim on another man's child. When the dust settled, Tom formally took Daniel under his wing, not because it was some cunning scheme, but because a promise had already been made and had become stronger than any oath sworn in court. Together they rebuilt a home where children laughed and ate their fill, and where Daniel no longer feared the gate. The memory of old losses did not vanish, but Tom learned to keep it like a fire that warms rather than consumes. And the boy who had asked a stranger to be his pa for one day was given a life that stretched across many dawns, slow, simple, and full of small victories. And one evening, long after, as they sat on the porch listening to the wind playing in the grass, Tom realized the most important promise had been kept, not for glory or any legal right to another man's child, but because sometimes being a father means simply refusing to back down until someone has a home.